People think the show starts when the audience applauds. They're wrong. For me, the show always starts about 20 minutes before that. And the hallway outside Studio 8H begins sounding less like a television studio and more like an airport 5 minutes before every flight leaves at once. Producers are jogging without admitting they're jogging. Writers are rewriting jokes they swore were finished an hour ago. Stage managers somehow manage to look completely calm while carrying enough responsibility to power a small country. Makeup artists perform miracles with 30 seconds and a powder brush. Somewhere a cue card gets reprinted because someone remembered an extra comma. Meanwhile, Michael is somehow the calmest person in the building. I hate him for that. Not really, mostly. He's sitting across from me in the dressing room, reading through the stack of jokes as if he's looking over a takeaway menu instead of material that will soon be heard by millions of people. Feel good? He asks. No, you never do, exactly. We've done this together for years, and somehow the routine never changes. 5 minutes before airtime, I become convinced every joke is terrible. Michael becomes convinced everything is fine. Usually one of us is right. Sometimes it's even me. The strangest thing about working on a comedy news desk is that every week the world insists on writing material that's somehow even crazier than the writers in our room. You sit down Monday morning thinking surely politics will calm down for 1 week. Then Tuesday arrives. By Wednesday, someone has held a press conference that sounds like it was generated by a broken fortune cookie. Thursday, another politician has explained something in a way that somehow makes it twice as confusing. Friday morning, everyone walks into the writer's room carrying fresh headlines and the exact same expression. Well, we're rewriting everything. Again, people assume writing political jokes is easy because politicians constantly say ridiculous things. Actually, that makes it harder. When reality starts sounding like parody, your job isn't simply writing punchlines anymore. Your job becomes figuring out how to make something unbelievable seem even more unbelievable without inventing anything. Sometimes the headline already contains the joke. Sometimes all you have to do is read it slowly and let the audience catch up. Other times you stare at a sentence for 20 minutes, wondering whether America has officially become satire. Meetings usually begin with someone reading headlines out loud. Nobody laughs immediately. That's the dangerous part. When writers don't laugh right away, they're thinking someone eventually raises a hand. If we compare it to another writer interrupts, no, that's too normal. Someone else says, go bigger. Then somebody in the corner quietly says the funniest thing anyone has heard all day. Nobody acknowledges it. Simply write it down. Comedy rooms are funny like that. The biggest laughs often happen completely by accident. By the afternoon, whiteboards are filled with arrows, crossed out ideas, replacement ideas, replacements for the replacements, and little notes reminding us which stories changed. While we were writing jokes about them, news refuses to stay still, neither can we. By rehearsal, we have something that resembles a complete show. Resembles. That word is doing a lot of work because even during rehearsal, we know half of it might change before airtime. Someone from standards walks in. Another producer whispers that a quote has been updated. A legal note appears. A graphic changes. One more rewrite. Always one more rewrite. That's live television. People watching at home imagine confidence. What they're actually seeing is organized panic wearing a nice suit. Comes the countdown. 5, 4, 3. The audience quits. 2, 1. The music begins. Every week that opening theme somehow erases the previous hour of chaos. Michael smiles. I smile. The cameras find us. Lights hit. Now there's nowhere else to be. Good evening. The words are familiar enough to become comforting, like muscle memory. Like stepping onto a basketball court you visited 1,000 times. You stop thinking about yourself. You think about rhythm. Timing, the audience, the next sentence, the next laugh. That's all. People ask whether it's difficult making jokes about presidents or senators or world leaders. Honestly, the difficult part isn't making fun of power. Comedy has always done that. The difficult part is making sure you're laughing upward instead of downward. A joke should challenge confidence, not vulnerability. It should surprise people, it should reveal something, or at the very least make someone snort unexpectedly. Sometimes all three, the audience that night felt especially tuned in. You can tell within 30 seconds. It's impossible to explain unless you've experienced it. Some crowds politely wait, others arrive ready to laugh. This audience wanted to play. That's a gift. The first laugh settles everyone's heartbeat, mine included. Michael delivers his first joke. Big laugh. Good, the rhythm is alive. Now it's my turn. There's something strangely satisfying about hearing an audience react exactly where you hoped they would. Because you're looking for applause, because it means they traveled with you. A joke is basically a tiny road trip. You begin in one place, you convince people they're heading somewhere predictable, then you turn left. If they laugh, they enjoyed the surprise. If they don't, well, that's just called television. One headline leads naturally into another. Politics, foreign affairs, campaign speeches, government announcements. Every story somehow trying to outdo the previous one. The audience isn't just laughing at politicians, they're laughing at the absurdity of trying to process everything happening all at once. That's become part of modern life. We're expected to absorb 20 enormous stories before breakfast. Comedy doesn't slow the news. It gives people permission to stop for a second, to recognize how strange everything sounds. That's valuable. Maybe more valuable now than ever. Every joke changes the room slightly. Some get immediate explosions. Others build slowly as people realize where the sentence is going. My favorite laughs are delayed laughs. Those are the ones where you can almost hear thousands of brains making the same connection at exactly the same moment. It's beautiful. Like synchronized confusion, Michael and I rarely discuss individual jokes once we're on air. We trust each other. If he lands something huge, I enjoy it. If I miss one, he doesn't celebrate. Partners don't keep score. They keep rhythm. That rhythm matters, especially when covering politics. People often assume audiences only laugh when they agree. That's not true. People laugh when they recognize something. Recognition is more powerful than agreement. If a joke reflects an obvious contradiction, even people with different opinions often react the same way, not because they change sides, because they recognized human behavior. Comedy starts there. Human behavior. Politicians change. Administrations change. News cycles change. People stay wonderfully weird. Someone always wants attention. Someone always refuses responsibility. Someone always insists everything is perfect while standing inside a fire. That's timeless. Halfway through the show, I glance toward the audience. It's another habit. You never focus on one person. You scan. Little reactions tell stories. Someone wiping tears from laughing. Someone nudging their spouse before the punchline lands. Someone trying desperately not to laugh because they know they're on camera. Live audiences become part of the performance. They aren't better collaborators. Without them, the jokes only exist on paper. With them, they're alive. Between commercial breaks, the studio transforms again. Crew members move cameras with astonishing speed. Producers whisper updates. Someone hands us revised pages. Michael reads exactly one line before saying, "Looks good." I read the same page 12 times, different personalities, same destination. As the second half approached, material shifted beyond quick headlines. The room settled into a different rhythm. Less about individual stories, more about patterns. Because after enough years behind that desk, you notice something. Political news isn't simply a collection of isolated events. It's also a collection of recurring habits. Letters defend themselves. Opponents attack. Commentators react. Social media amplifies everything. And the cycle begins again. The challenge for comedians isn't predicting politics. It's recognizing the repetition before everyone else does. That's where the strongest observations come from, not the loudest ones, clearest ones. Sometimes all it takes is pointing gently at something everyone already sees. The audience laughs not because you've invented an idea, because you finally said it out loud. It's when I realized our best material wasn't really about any single politician. It was about how power responds when someone holds up a mirror. Sometimes the sharpest joke isn't the one with the biggest punchline. Sometimes it's the one that leaves the room quiet for half a second before everyone laughs together. When people watch a comedy news show from home, they usually remember the punchlines. What I remember are the pauses, the awkward ones, the meaningful ones, those tiny fractions of a second after a joke lands, when the audience isn't quite sure whether to laugh immediately or think first. Those are my favorite moments. A big laugh is exciting. A thoughtful laugh is addictive. There's a difference. One comes from surprise, the other comes from recognition. As the show rolled into its second half, I could feel that recognition happening more and more. We'd moved beyond the rapid-fire headlines into something a little broader, not a lecture, not a debate, just an observation about how public life seems to work. Politics often looks like a boxing match on television. Comedy, its best, feels more like holding up a mirror. The funny part isn't inventing a ridiculous situation, it's noticing that reality already beat you to it. People often ask whether writing political comedy means choosing sides. Honestly, the job feels more like choosing contradictions. If someone says one thing and does another, that's interesting. If somebody spends more time explaining why critics are wrong than explaining how they'll solve a problem, it's interesting too. Comedy lives in the gap between words and behavior. That gap never stays empty for long. During commercial breaks, the energy backstage changes completely. The audience hears music. We hear organized chaos. Someone rushes over with an updated line. A producer quietly says, "We trimmed 8 seconds." Another whispers, "Camera 3 instead of camera 1. The cue card team swaps out pages with the precision of a Formula One pit crew. Then, just as quickly as the frenzy arrives, it disappears. The countdown starts again. Everyone returns to their places. It's almost funny how calm television looks from the outside. Inside, it's controlled turbulence. People leaned over before we came back on. "You ready?" "I was ready yesterday," I said. "For today?" "Absolutely not." He laughed. That's another thing viewers rarely notice. Most of our conversations last about 5 seconds. Years of working together have taught us that if one person is overthinking something, the other person's job isn't to fix it. It's simply to keep moving. Momentum matters. So does trust. You don't survive live television without both. The next run of material explored the strange relationship between politicians, commentators, and the people watching from home. Every public figure has critics. Every public figure has supporters. The fascinating part is watching what happens when neither side can stop paying attention to the other. Sometimes criticism becomes the story. Sometimes the response to the criticism becomes an even bigger story. It's almost impossible to separate the two. I've noticed something over the years. Power usually expects resistance. What it doesn't always expect is observation. Resistance can be argued with. Observation is trickier. If someone simply points out what's happening and the audience recognizes it on their own, there isn't much left to debate. Nobody likes feeling as though they're explaining an obvious contradiction, especially in public. That's one reason comedy can be so uncomfortable for people in authority. Not because jokes are dangerous. Because jokes are memorable, a policy paper might be forgotten in a week. A sharp one-liner can survive for years. Sometimes that's unfair. Sometimes it's completely deserved. Either way, humor has a remarkable way of sticking around. As the night continued, I looked around the studio again. Every audience has its own personality. Some crowds react loudly to every joke. Others hold back until something catches them completely off guard. This audience loved delayed reactions. You could almost see the moment a joke clicked, a smile, a pause. And an entire section of the room bursting into laughter together. It's oddly satisfying, like watching dominoes fall one after another. Easter. Working in comedy has also taught me that people often misunderstand what a joke is trying to do. A joke isn't a courtroom verdict. It doesn't decide who's right. It doesn't settle history. It simply shines a light on a moment and asks the audience, "Did you notice this too?" Sometimes they did. Sometimes they noticed something completely different. That's fine. Comedy is a conversation, not a command. Challenge is making that conversation feel natural. Natural, if people feel like they're being lectured, you've already lost them. No body turns on a late night comedy show hoping to receive homework. They want to laugh. Maybe think a little, then laugh again. That's the balance. One writer once described it perfectly. He said, the audience should feel smarter after the joke, not because we explained everything, because we trusted them to connect the dots. I've never forgotten that the best audiences don't need every line explained. They're already halfway there. You simply meet them in the middle. Trust creates a unique relationship between performers and viewers. Every week, millions of people invite us into their living rooms. Some agree with us, some don't. Some watch specifically because they know they'll disagree. Oddly enough, all of them are part of the same experience. That's television. It's one of the last places where complete strangers can react to the same moment at exactly the same time. The world doesn't have many experiences like that anymore. Backstage, after another segment, one of the younger writers asked me, I ever get used to reading jokes that might be dissected online before the show's even over. I laughed. Used to it? No, you don't worry. Of course I worry. But worrying doesn't make the joke funnier. He nodded. That's another lesson live television teaches you. Eventually, every joke belongs to the audience. You can polish it, rewrite it, argue over every word. The second you say it out loud, it isn't yours anymore. People decide what it means. Sometimes they hear exactly what you intended. Sometimes they hear something you never imagined. Either way, you move on to the next line. You don't have time to look back. The red light on the camera doesn't wait for self-doubt. It just stays on. The more years I spend behind that desk, the more I appreciate how unusual the job really is. Where else do you spend an entire week reading serious headlines, discussing complicated issues, debating wording down to a single syllable, only to discover that the biggest laugh of the night comes from a completely unexpected observation? Comedy has a way of humbling everyone, especially comedians. No matter how carefully you plan a show, the audience always has the final edit. That's comforting in a strange way. It reminds you that television isn't a monologue, it's a shared experience. The lights, the cameras, the laughter, the silence, every one of them matters. And somewhere between those moments, you occasionally stumble onto something bigger than a punchline, not an answer, not a solution. Just a clearer way of seeing what's already in front of you. By the time we reached the final stretch of the broadcast, I realized that was what I enjoyed most about nights like this. The jokes would eventually fade. Headlines would change by tomorrow morning. Another news cycle would begin. Another stack of cue cards would be waiting. But every now and then, one observation lingers a little longer than the laugh itself, because it shouted the loudest, because it quietly invited everyone watching to ask the same question. It happens when the people with the most power spend more time reacting to criticism than responding to the problems everyone else is living through. The audience didn't answer out loud. They didn't have to. Sometimes the most memorable moment in a comedy show isn't the punchline, it's the brief silence that comes right before the applause. The strange thing about live television is that the audience always remembers the beginning. They remember the opening line. They remember the biggest laugh. Sometimes they remember the joke that unexpectedly became everyone's favorite. Very few people remember the ending. Not because it isn't important, because by then they're already thinking about whatever comes next. That's the funny part about working in comedy. You spend an entire week building 90 minutes that disappear almost as soon as they're over. The final segment wrapped, the studio audience applauded, the cameras pulled back, and the familiar closing music filled the room. The red light on the camera blinked off. Just like that, the show was over. Millions of people watching at home, it ended with a theme song. For everyone inside the studio, another evening was just beginning. Crew members started moving cameras before the applause had completely faded. Stage managers were already talking about next week's schedule. Writers compared notes on jokes they wished they had phrased differently. Someone was celebrating a line that had landed much bigger than expected. Someone else was already apologizing for one that didn't. That's comedy. Nobody leaves believing the show was perfect. If they do, they probably haven't been paying attention. Michael stood up, stretched, and looked over at me. So what? You survived. I always survive. Barely still counts. He laughed. Working together for so long had taught us something valuable. Neither of us obsessed over individual jokes for very long. If you spend all night celebrating the hits, you'll miss tomorrow's work. If you spend all night mourning the misses, you'll never write another line. The healthiest place to be is somewhere in the middle. Enjoy the moment. The lesson moved forward. As we walked away from the desk, I glanced back at the empty studio. Without an audience, it looked surprisingly ordinary. Just lights, chimeras, cue cards, chairs, pieces of painted scenery. It reminded me of visiting a theater the morning after a performance. The magic isn't stored in the building. It's created by the people inside it. That had always fascinated me. Television feels permanent because millions of people see it. In reality, it's incredibly temporary. A joke exists for only a few seconds, a laugh lasts even less. Then both disappear. What stays behind isn't usually the exact wording, it's the feeling, the mood, the memory of sharing a moment with strangers. That's why comedy matters more than people sometimes realize. Not because it solves problems. It doesn't. Not because it changes elections overnight. It doesn't do that either. Comedy does something quieter. It gives people permission to acknowledge the absurd. It reminds us that confusion isn't weakness. Sometimes it's simply an honest reaction to a complicated world. The writer's room was still buzzing when we returned. Somebody had already turned one of the night's biggest laughs into a running joke among the staff. Another writer was predicting which clip would end up circulating online by morning. Nobody knew. Nobody ever knows. The internet has a personality all its own. Sometimes a carefully crafted piece becomes the headline. Sometimes a tiny unscripted reaction steals the entire conversation. You learn not to predict it. You simply make the best show you can. Everything after that belongs to the audience. One of the newer staff members asked me whether I still read comments after every episode. I smiled. Sometimes. And sometimes they're thoughtful. Sometimes they think I'm a genius. And the rest, they've met me. The room laughed. Self-awareness is surprisingly useful in comedy. If you can't laugh at yourself, eventually someone else will do it for you. Probably on television, probably while you're watching. I've learned that audiences are smarter than many people give them credit for. They don't expect perfection. They don't even expect agreement. What they expect is honesty, not political honesty. Human honesty. They know when someone genuinely believes what they're saying. They also know when someone is performing certainty they don't actually feel. People recognize authenticity remarkably quickly, maybe because it's become rarer. Outside the studio, New York continued doing what New York always does. Traffic moved, people hurried down the sidewalks, restaurants filled with conversations that had nothing to do with our show. Taxi drivers debated politics. Friends argued over dinner. Tourists searched for landmarks. The city never pauses simply because television has ended. I like that. It's a healthy reminder that no program sits at the center of the universe. Life keeps moving. Tomorrow's headlines are already waiting. Somewhere, another politician is giving another speech. Somewhere else, another journalist is asking difficult questions. A writer is opening a blank document. A producer is checking tomorrow's schedule. Another comedian is looking at the same headlines and wondering where the joke is hiding. The cycle continues. That's comforting. It means there's always another opportunity to get it right, or at least slightly righter than last time. As I walked home that evening, I thought less is about individual jokes and more about something we'd been discussing in the writer's room earlier in the week. Why do certain moments stay with people? Not because they're louder, not because they're meaner, because they generate the biggest argument. The moments that last usually have something else in common. They reveal a contradiction people had already sensed but hadn't quite put into words. Once they hear it, you can't unsee it. That's the real strength of observation. It doesn't force people toward a conclusion. It simply invites them to notice. The rest happens naturally. Public life has always included criticism. It always will. People in power have critics. People outside power have critics too. That's part of living in a free society. The interesting question isn't whether criticism exists. It's how people respond to it. Some ignore it. Some fight it. Some embrace it. Some accidentally prove it. Watching those reactions has probably taught me more about human nature than politics ever could. Strip away the titles, ends the offices. Forget the headlines. At the end of the day, because people are still people. We all want to be understood. We all dislike being embarrassed. We all occasionally say something we'd rather take back. The difference is that most of us don't do it with cameras pointed at our faces. Vision magnifies everything. A confident moment becomes legendary. An awkward moment becomes a meme. A thoughtful pause becomes 1,000 online interpretations. That's the bargain. You don't get the privilege of a public platform without accepting public scrutiny. The same applies to comedians. Every joke carries a risk. Every performance carries uncertainty. That's exactly why the job remains exciting. Every laugh were guaranteed, comedy would become accounting, predictable, reliable, completely uninteresting. Instead, every show begins with possibility. Maybe tonight everything clicks. Maybe one unexpected line changes the rhythm of the room. Maybe the quietest observation becomes the loudest conversation tomorrow. You never know. That's what keeps you coming back. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had settled into its familiar late-night rhythm. Phones were already buzzing with reactions. Articles were beginning to appear. Clips were making their way across social media. Some people loved the show, some didn't. Some were already arguing about jokes they hadn't actually heard in full. Another timeless tradition. I set my phone aside. The internet would still be there in the morning. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water, sat by the window, and enjoyed something that had become increasingly rare. Silence, no applause, no countdown, no cue cards. Just a quiet room overlooking a city that never completely sleeps. Those moments matter too. Where next week's ideas usually begin, because the truth is, comedy isn't really about having all the answers. If it were, we'd all be terrible at it. Comedy is about curiosity, about asking questions, noticing patterns, about helping people step back for just a moment and see familiar situations from an unexpected angle. Sometimes that unexpected angle creates laughter. Sometimes it creates reflection. This night somehow managed both. Before going to bed, I thought about something one of our oldest writers had told me years earlier. He said, "Never chase the biggest laugh." At first, I thought he meant timing. Eventually, I realized he meant something deeper. The biggest laugh disappears, the strongest idea lingers. If you're lucky enough to create both at the same time, you've had a very good night. The studio lights would come on again soon enough. Another week, another pile of headlines, another audience waiting for someone to make sense of a world that often refuses to make sense of itself. When that familiar countdown begins again, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, I know exactly how I'll feel. A little nervous, a little excited, grateful, because every time that red light turns on, offers the same opportunity. Not to win an argument, not to settle politics, simply to remind people that even in complicated times, there's still value in taking an honest look at ourselves, sharing a laugh, recognizing that sometimes the most memorable moments aren't the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the quiet pause that follows, right before everyone laughs together.
Oh,